Smith. Maybe a couple of seconds and I will.
Hi, I'm Selwyn Manning and you are watching A View from Afar. And as always, we are joined by political scientist and former Pentagon analyst Paul Buchanan. And this week we will discuss. In the weeks leading up to the United States elections, there have been a number of countries around the world that have seen voters swing away from economically liberal right parties to attach their votes to parties of the centre left. These include countries as diverse as New Zealand and Bolivia. Today we will look at these two election outcomes and in particular discuss the trends, foreign policy and whether these two elections actually indicate a change in global mood. But first, here's an invitation to those of you who are joining us live. If you are joining us via YouTube, Facebook or Twitter, feel free to make comments, and if you do, we'll be able to include your interaction in this program. So let's cross to Paul now for a deep dive into these issues. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon, Selwyn.
So it's been politics all around for the last few weeks and indeed in the last few months. Certainly here in New Zealand, it's been election campaigning left, right and centre, delayed because of the second COVID outbreak. That seems to have been defeated. Elections back on. October 17 last Saturday was the last day of voting and we got Jacinda Ardern's Labour Party for the first time in MMP history able to get across the line and to rule, if it so chooses to, on its own without the support of a coalition partner. Over in Bolivia, and we will talk about Bolivia in specific terms halfway through this program and dedicate times, we've seen big outcomes there too, obviously in the wake of right-wing military coup in last year, if I understand it correctly, and we've got a more leftist election result in Bolivia, and we'll talk to Paul. Paul, won't we talk to you about exactly what is happening there and what people can expect from such a result. But first, let's get back to the New Zealand elections. For Paul, in the first instance, what did you make of the whole thing?
Oh, well, I think that it was a vote for stability, for continuity, and a reward for competence at a governmental level. The fact is that this milestone election clearly indicates that the public in New Zealand is happy with how Labour has run the ship of state. And I'll defer to you to discuss whether the mandate they've been given, the 64 seats in a 120-seat parliament, is a mandate on the Prime Minister alone or on the party in general. I tend to think it's a mandate for the party. I mean, our Prime Minister is charismatic. She knows what she's doing. But I think there was more to it than that. I mean, they've had their pitfalls. You know, there's been some things that haven't gone their way. But I think at the end of the day, the pandemic sealed it. Because what New Zealanders do see, and New Zealanders, for those who don't know the Kiwi spirit, are usually very humble, self-effacing. They look around the world and they find that New Zealand handled the pandemic as good or better than pretty much anyone else, big or small.
Taiwan's the only other one that is, arguably performed better in being able to keep COVID from taking off within its shores.
Hey, Selwyn, just for our viewers who are in two-party systems, who are not familiar with multi-party systems, can you run down the difference? I mean, I could, but you know, I've tried explaining to American friends why I like our system, and some of them can't get their heads around it. So basically, what was the deal on Saturday?
Okay, well, like you've alluded to in past episodes, New Zealand operates under a mixed member proportional representation system. It's MMP, as we call it, and that is the same In large part, the similarities are most evident in Germany, for example, and certainly Japan. It came in post-Second World War as a type of system that provided representation, but also made it difficult for one party to get its hands on power and basically take countries to areas that they never anticipated as voters. And I suppose that all we had to do to see the reasons for MMP's existence was to look at what had happened to Germany prior to the Second World War being brought out into global disaster. Disaster. So that, in a sense, is what we're talking about. Here in New Zealand, under MMP, we have a situation where should a party get 5% of the popular vote, it is assured to be in Parliament. If it does not get 5% of the popular vote, then it can still get to Parliament, but only if one of its candidates wins an electorate seat. And we have electorate seats all over the country, just like in other countries like the United States, where you'll have votes at, at state level, etc., etc. So, we have that kind of thing here with electorate seats mapped out around the whole country. On that basis, there is a lot of concern by smaller parties that should they just miss out on that 5% threshold, and if they do not win an electorate seat, then they're out. They may get 4.9% at the end of the day once special votes are counted and postal ballots, etc., etc. If they don't make that 5%, they're gone. And so that's a fear of the smaller parties. That creates a fear also for smaller parties that may naturally find that they have a partner in a large party that may wish them to become a part of a coalition. And in this sense, what we're seeing in New Zealand at the moment is the Labour Party on Saturday won more than it required to hold a majority in the House. Particularly after specials are counted, it is anticipated that the Labour Party, led by Jacinda Ardern, is going to have over the 50% mark. That's the anticipation. At the moment, it's 49.1. The Green Party, which it's at this stage is its natural partner party, if you like, it was struggling through part of this year to hold its nose above the 5%. If it didn't win an electorate seat, it could have easily have been gone. As it turned out, the swing to the Labour and to the Green Party was such that the Green Party's won a key crucial seat, of which is Auckland Central, that was held by the Nationals last time. The National Party here in New Zealand, a conservative centre-right, liberal right economic party, which through the 1990s and also the 2008 through to 2017 held the balance of power in New Zealand. So we saw the Green Party come through, take that seat, win it against Labour, and third place against the national candidate, a new national candidate. So it was assured to be in Parliament. We also saw it punch above its weight, get more share of the vote in the election on the party list vote. So this is where it starts getting complex, probably for those that are outside of New Zealand. But it looks like it too, the Green Party, could very well pick up somewhere around the areas of up to 1%, and even some people who are very encouraged feel that could actually pull in from the specials an extra %, which would bring in 10, 11 MPs into the House. The question inside the Green Party has been raging since the election that with Labour having such a huge vote, is its voice, should it join Labour in a coalition or indeed even in some sort of arrangement where it has ministerial responsibilities of some portfolios, will it lose its voice and become irrelevant? And my view, Paul, here is very, very straightforward. I think the Green Party has an opportunity with the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern saying she wants to build consensus. The Labour Party knows that its vote at this stage is probably at its zenith, that in 3 years or 4 years' time when New Zealand has the next election, the chances are of it having such a decisive and impressive win is probably not going to materialise. So I think that's what Jacinda Ardern is talking about when she is saying she is wanting to build a coalition around her party, where even she's not excluding talking to, for example, the Māori Party MP now, who beat Labour candidates and incumbents to win his seat in the east side of the New Zealand's North Island. That to me suggests that what she is talking about is an inclusive and certainly a cooperative kind of arrangement here, where she is saying to Māoridom, every Māori representative that you send to Parliament from the Māori electorate seats, we can work with. That's what I read from that. Secondly, with the Green Party and this consensus building, I think she's saying, look, we know as a Labour Party, we may need you very well in the next 3 or 4 years' time. We want you along for the ride now. But the Green Party, with its activist base that has been shoved out of the road in recent years, is saying, well, not the Green Party leadership here, but its members and supporters are saying, well, hang on a minute. We think we're actually in a more stronger position with independence should we not become a part of executive government. So that's where New Zealand is. But getting back down to the big swings, we have seen Labour go from down in the top 30s into what will end up over 50% of the vote. The Nationals going from, around the mid 40s, 45, 46% of what they would expect to get from a vote, usually, as a broad tent party, down at 26 points. So that's a complete rout of them. They just don't lose members in Parliament. They lose their share of research budgets, parliamentary services budgets, all of this kind of thing to help their party remain relevant. That's all gone. They're stripped down to their skeleton. That's how I see it, Paul. Hopefully that explanation for those of our people that are overseas can make something of it.
Yeah, I would just add that for the people who don't understand MMP, you and I on Saturday, we had 4 things to vote on. The party vote, the electorate vote in our electorates, yours is different than mine, and then 2 referenda, one on cannabis legalization and the other one on voluntary euthanasia. The results of the referenda have yet to be determined, but the idea is, you split your vote as a matter of course. I mean, you could vote straight ticket on the electorate and the party, but a lot of people don't. But what's interesting, I think, is not only everything that you've just said and explained it very well, but I think that in large measure, Nationals' crashing defeat was not so much a referendum on their economic policies. Remember, they haven't been in government, but on the craziness in their leadership caucus. 3 leaders in the space of 9 months, a lot of backbiting, a lot of dissension within the ranks.
Disunity.
And I think, right. And so you look over at Labour, who are handling the affairs of government in a pretty unified way. And then you look at the opposition without those responsibilities, and they're all over the show. And so I think this was punishment of National for not getting their act together. What I found interesting was 2 things on the right. The first is that New Zealand First, a nationalist populist party, got the boot.
Outski, with only 2-point-something%,
For all the rhetoric, that rhetoric, well, you think of national populism, anti-immigrant, economic,
all the old culprit, the same thing. We saw it in Australia, so it'll be interesting to see what happens over there.
Yeah, no residents, and they've been in Parliament for quite a long while, but they got the boot. But then, interestingly, the people on the right who picked up votes were the so-called ACT Party, which used to be a libertarian party, but now is this catch-all of gun freaks, religious nutters.
Like the NRA kind of groupings wrapped around a New Zealand equivalent kind of thing going in and taking over what was once an economic liberal reformist party. And its Labour, its leader is the only one that could really be labelled in such ways, I would argue. The other thing that I think is very symbolic in this election, and it's one which would worry I think those proponents that believe in small government, that National Party that has absolutely been destroyed at these elections, represented small government, economic liberalism, one where it didn't change its mantras from really the 1990s and the latter part of the 2000s, where the market will decide the outcomes of many crucial issues. There are some issues that require government intervention, but that should always be tempered by the liberal freedoms, etc., etc. Now, if you correspond that to what Jacinda Ardern's party, the Labour Party, has been operating as the lead party in government for the last 3 years, it's not blowing out government, but it's saying government is relevant, it's interventionist, it is there to assist in times of crisis in a way of which no other body in society or in an economy can. And that, to me, stands out in this vote, that people confronting, here in New Zealand, they've had earthquakes, we've had massacres by right-wing extremists here, we've had volcanoes blowing their top and killing people, and we've had Jacinda Ardern and the Labour Party govern through those major events. We've got COVID appears, and they've been able to get rid of COVID twice out of New Zealand from the point of view of community transmission. And I think the people are thinking government and effective interventionist government is what they want. In some ways, the only criticisms that I have been able to determine, and I argue that those are National Party voters that have come around to that thinking too. And the only dissenting thing that I can pick up relating to Labour is the pace of incrementalism toward those interventionist policies, of building the social structures of New Zealand back, the government provisions, such as state housing and healthcare, free education, free tertiary university education, getting those back in large part by government-driven commitment. And the pace of shifting back to those paradigms, if you want to put it in that way, is not fast enough for many people who are voting. So that leaves the Nationals, in a very, very tough situation where they don't just have to reinvigorate their candidates and their MPs, they've got to rethink their whole sense of their DNA. That's how I see that part, Paul.
Yeah. I mean, what's very clear is that the combination of natural and human disasters and the Labour government response has shown the limits of what the market can do when addressing very serious social crises. And that hasn't been lost on anybody. Everybody sees that the state came in and intervened for the benefit of everyone. Now, that assumes competence on the part of state managers.
Absolutely.
And that's not always the case. So I would first say that, yes, the state is back in, but there are two caveats to that. The first one is that because of prudent financial management, the New Zealand State Treasury had money to burn when it came to pandemic mitigation efforts.
Yep.
The wage subsidy, business allowances, they marshaled their funds very well. Now going forward, they don't have that money. They used up a lot of the surplus in Treasury in order to pursue these mitigation efforts. So they're going to have to be financially prudent anyway. And the second part of that is that Labour has had some failures with public housing, among others. And
not fast enough to roll out.
They promised too much on certain keystone issues, and they got burned. So between the financial constraints and the fact that they burned before, what I would say is we're more than likely going to see that incrementalist approach, with core areas being determined not just by Labour, but here's where the Greens come in. If I was a Green, I wouldn't enter into a coalition with Labour.
Yeah, I'm completely on the other side than where you are on this one. Yeah,
no, we're different. But I would say this, and that's part of the why we get along. I think they should be, doing what is known here as confidence and supply. Right. Refuse the baubles of office, because if you enter in a coalition, you might get a ministry, that sort of thing. And because Labour's always got to be wary of how you're going to vote in Parliament on various bills, you can keep them honest.
I get that part. Yeah, I get that part. My counter to that was, if the Greens are going to have a forward-leaning movement, then they've already got ministerial political ministerial experience with three very impressive ministers, one in an associate minister position, and they have their young, dynamic MP that won that Auckland seat off the Nationals and ahead of Labour, Chloe Swarbrick. Now, at some point, if they're looking to the future, they need to blood Chloe into ministerial politics, not just sit on the crossbenches and be an activist-based party. If they want to slice the action in the future, then there's other things in play here. I'm sorry, jumping in on your thing there. But.
Yeah, no, good point. Good point. Final point on this, because again, I defer to you because you read the tea leaves a lot better than me. We do have to be concerned, though, that, and that's been the perennial concern, that Labor governing alone could be a problem.
Yeah.
Now, I happen to think this iteration of the Labor Party and this particular leadership cadre will not be a problem. They will be prudent. They will be cautious. They'll listen to the Greens. And that's why I say, well, the Greens may or may not want to be in, but I hear your logic.
Yeah.
But you can be assured that we are going to hear from the get-go, from the right, that Labor governing is tyrannical. It's on the way to one-party rule, dictatorship this and dictatorship that. And if that's the case, I'd hate to say it, but these guys are going to lose in 3 years.
Yeah, they can't go on that negative bent on this. What was sadly lacking in this debate around the election campaign leading up to the result last Saturday, in my view, was that while National was putting policy out, that policy was not necessarily the solutions for the problems and challenges we face at this time. And it needs to actually become relevant with a solution-based set of policies of which they have a priority ladder that matches with the public's requirement for active government in these particular key areas. That, I think, is where National was sadly lacking. Labor was ahead of it. It was ahead of all of those issues. It is no surprise that Labor has actually been returned with the biggest in 50 years, isn't it? Since 1946. So it's over 50 years.
And you're right about National in that there's that old saying that generals always fight the last war when planning for the future.
Yeah.
And that's what National was doing. National, interestingly, Labor is accused of being dominated by the unions. National is dominated by economic interests, agricultural interests in particular, that are not reflective of the larger economic demographic of society. Many people may not know outside of New Zealand, we're a heavily urbanized country. And yes, we have export dependence on certain primary goods and commodities. But quite frankly, this is a nation of services, service sectors, a lot of which are also for export. So they're beholden to, if I was to use the old academic jargon, a fraction of capital that is increasingly archaic. Yeah. And they're not quite getting up with the play with the new entrepreneurial sectors who are not interested in agricultural subsidies, are not interested in, for example, diverting water to agricultural interests. And that these are urban elites. And so they got to get, they got to get up with the play.
And there's also, just to cap off that particular part of the discussion, the other thing relating to Labor's approach to agriculture is to develop value-added export opportunities through having a more clean, green, environmentally sustainable effort on behalf of the agriculture sector. National was regressing back to what would have been acceptable arguments of the 1990s on those points. Now, very quickly, we should get back to the premise of where is New Zealand relating to the foreign policy, and I'll just skip through that really quickly. In my view, it actually has a depth of talent that can fill that. But ahead of all of that, and it's sticking my head out here because there hasn't been a lot of discussion relating to who would be our foreign minister on the global patch, with Winston Peters, the leader of New Zealand First, having vacated Parliament, been voted out. So I think David Parker is the person. He has experience not only as somebody that is able to gel our foreign interests relating to trade expression as former trade minister, but he has also got the credentials and the respect of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, certainly of the New Zealand cabinet in waiting here now, and I think he's the front runner. With respect to defence, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw somebody a minister who has had uniform experience, except, from a minister point of view. I'm not talking a former grunt like our former Defence Minister Ron Mark. I'm talking more like Stuart Nash. I would not be surprised if we saw Stuart Nash dovetailing in there with David Parker, but in the role of Minister of Defence for New Zealand. And I think New Zealand's position relating to foreign policy, Paul, will be much more Pacific region orientated, and I think defence will reflect that as well. I think Jacinda Ardern in this election is the first time the public has put her in as the leader. The last time when she became Prime Minister was at the invitation of the centrist New Zealand First Party that had chose her to be the leader of the country. This time the people have chosen it. I think her mana, as we say here in New Zealand, is behind her, and that mandate to actually stamp out New Zealand's role, independent Pacific state role, is going to be something we'll see in foreign policy. We should get on to Bolivia, Paul. We should talk about
all I'll say on that is I agree with you. I just think that the approach will be to leverage New Zealand's enhanced reputation worldwide as a result of the pandemic into gains of a multilateral and regional sort on both the defense front as well as foreign policy, no matter who wins the U.S. election and the global circumstances otherwise. So, I tend to agree, regardless of who's appointed, that's the direction we're headed.
Well said, Paul. To Bolivia, big elections. You want to take the floor on this one?
Okay. So the historical recap is this. The long-term socialist president, indigenous president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, was forced out of office last year amid claims that his re-election, which he had constitutionally staged, was fraudulent, that there was ballot fraud and all those sort of things. And he was forced into exile by the military, who didn't fire a shot, although there was a lot of civil unrest. And he was replaced by a right-wing president who had been the president of the legislature, at the head of a coalition of various right-wing factions, who then, it turns out, were incredibly corrupt, went on basically a thievery spree, as well as a murderous spree against activists and leaders of Evo Morales' political movement, which is known as the Movement Towards Socialism. So the 9 months or so, in fact, the year since Morales has been removed, have been characterized by chaos, instability, and it turns out these right-wing coalition were no better, and in many cases much worse than Evo Morales. So, to their credit, they agreed to an election that was free and fair. That election was held this past weekend. And lo and behold, Morales' two-time economic minister, a guy known as Lucho, that's a nickname, Arce, was elected president. Yeah. And so the movement towards socialism is back in office. Now, I will say two things.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, the two things are this. It turns out, in hindsight, that the claims of voter fraud and all of that were actually orchestrated by a disinformation campaign that came out of Washington, D.C. and Brasilia. Two right-wing democracies, quote unquote, the Trump administration and the Bolsonaro administration, don't like socialists. And so it turns out a lot of the supposed evidence against Morales was fabricated. This doesn't mean there wasn't some voter fraud, and it doesn't mean that Morales was clean as a whistle. There was corruption in his administration, but let's be honest, it's Bolivia. And so when the right-wingers turned out to be no better, and then revelations of the truth of the matter is Morales won fair and square, and he was robbed of that victory, I have a feeling the military in Bolivia were embarrassed that they got used by these foreign powers, and they signaled to the interim government that they're going to have to hold the elections again because this was a bit of a sham. Now, from the left point of view, Morales is going to go back to Bolivia, and then what? He's the leader of that political movement, and the guy who's now president used to work for him. Will there be problems between the two of them? Will the various factions within that lefty movement divide? Those are the questions that the Bolivians are going to confront immediately. And I would finally say that what happens in Bolivia by and large, stays in Bolivia. We shouldn't see this. We shouldn't see this as the beginning of a red tide, pink
Yeah.
tide. You know that this is a very Bolivian circumstance.
That's interesting, Paul, because I was most interested in what the symbolism was there. From the point of view of a writer for Council of Hemispheric Affairs, Koha, and I know that you've had past analyst type of roles there with Koha. Mm-hmm. Now, this William here from Caracas is writing that this election result is a point of inflection on the continent that advances the construction of a new South American socialist bloc. You're saying that he's overreading this. He's over-egging it, perhaps, or misreading the signals here. Because I was going to ask, with the instability in Venezuela, if a change in government in Bolivia was going to be is able to cement itself in. What does that mean for that part of the Americas and also from the point of view of this movement? But you're saying that this don't read in that this is the beginnings or the inflection point of an American socialist bloc.
I disagree with him. Again, we both. He's a current analyst. I used to be an analyst at Koha, a very reputable organization. But I think that he's engaging in some wishful thinking. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, in the last 5 years, we've had a shift to the right throughout Latin America. You know, from the Rio Grande all the way to Tierra del Fuego, that pink tide of the early 2000s has been rolled back. Brazil is under hard right-wing control. Even Uruguay is under right-center control. Chile's under right control. Where the left still stands, Venezuela and Nicaragua, they've become outright authoritarian. I mean, they've moved in a Stalinist direction, and I don't think anybody with any democratic inkling wants to go in that direction. So although this victory may give hopes to grassroots activists in many Latin American countries, let's say, for example, Chile, which is about to have a plebiscite on the 1980 authoritarian constitution, which is still in place today. Wow. They may be invigorated by this sort of people power. But the problems of socialism in Latin America are the problems of indigenous socialism. You know, this is not a European socialist movement. These are indigenous socialist movements that are very localized in their grievances and their approaches to politics. So what works in Bolivia to remove these right-wingers will not work in Argentina, which is under a Peronist regime that is nominally left, but anything but. Yeah. And certainly won't have the impact in places like Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, which is run by a right-winger, that many of, particularly the North American left, hope that it will have. So I very much think that this was a salutary moment in Bolivia history because this is the first time the left has been allowed to win again and not be ousted by force. Right. I mean, the fact that the military allowed this...
Is that the significance of that, Paul? Is this the big thing that stands out?
Think of it this way. I mean, there's a lot more to the picture, but I'll make it quick. Bolivia has the first or second largest reserves of lithium in the world. You know, lithium for batteries.
The world needs that.
Most of that is untapped. And so lithium extraction companies are all over Bolivia like a rash. And most of those companies come from, guess what? Brazil, the United States, and then Asia. Yeah. They don't like socialists. They don't like the fact that the profits that they will accrue will be redistributed in ways that they would prefer not to see. But if you're a Bolivian, you'd rather see them redistributed than maldistributed, which was what was going on under this interim government. So the big challenge for Odyssey is to stave off further interventionist campaigns, disinformation campaigns, and satisfy the bottom line of international investors who are going after those lithium riches. That's a tough nut to crack.
So you're saying that in Bolivia, the new government, should it be able to cement itself in, should not go hard left, but should look for perhaps a New Zealand Labour Party kind of centre-left type of approach, or is that beyond the abilities of those that are elected from actually responding to the wants of the voter?
Well, that's where the comparison with New Zealand gets interesting. Now, they're a very different type of left. Bolivians are very staunch.
Yeah.
I mean, their workers' movement and whatnot are a fighting movement.
A more Marxist type of approach to the left, as opposed to defined from.
They remind me, believe it or not, of South Korean unionists. Okay. I mean, they come out in the streets, they're wearing helmets, carrying, big sticks, and they're prepared for battle. I mean, they're prepared to fight the police. Now, the New Zealand union movement has none of that. I mean, there's none. So we're a much more mature democracy. I mean, we work through institutional channels. Those are still being established in Bolivia. So I think the interesting thing here is you've got a leftist president. He knows what's sitting under the ground in Bolivia that everybody wants. And so the issue is, how do you extract it to the benefit of the people of Bolivia, not for the benefit of the foreign investors alone?
Or the power elites within the country, yeah?
Bolivia is a mining country. First it was silver, then it was tin. They even had guano, bird dropping mining for a long time. And now it's lithium. The elites that are tied to those extractive industries are, to say the least, not very progressive. But times have changed, and clearly even they, particularly backed by foreign investors, can see that the best way to go here is to share the pie. It'll be big enough for everybody. And so the important thing for Odyssey is to lower the levels of corruption, to not have his hand in the till, not allow his party adherents to all of a sudden be building mansions and driving European cars. I mean, there's an old joke in Latin America that right-wing dictatorships are for the few, by the few. Left-wing dictatorships are for the many, by the few. Venezuela is a proof of the latter. And so if they avoid the Venezuela-Nicaragua scenario, where these leftist leaders who are brought in democratically increasingly harden up into authoritarian Stalinists, if they avoid that, if they're allowed to play democratically, and I would argue listen a bit to the opposition, find out what their bottom line is. If that bottom line is not disloyal, if that bottom line is not removal of you from office, if they're talking to Odyssey, then a compromise could be met for the betterment of everyone. Again, the riches are there. So we'll see. Everything I understand about Odyssey is that Morales was the ideologue, Odyssey is the pragmatist. And if that's the case, then this was a good choice for the Bolivian electorate.
So to wrap this up, does that mean that you expect that the right, the power elites, the military will allow the voice and the cumulative vote of the people to prevail? And secondly, does it mean that what you've just mapped out there, does that mean that Bolivia, under new leadership, needs to bow and scrape to the United States' interests, or develop some sort of rapprochement between the ideology and the United States administrations, irrespective of who wins the presidency there?
Well, the answer to the first is that the Bolivian military clearly allowed this election to happen.
Yep.
They could have stepped in at any moment, and they could have stopped, and you know what? No one would have said anything. The United States might have even applauded their intervention. And so it tells you that the Bolivian military is slowly but surely adopting or embracing democratic practice. As long as they're not interfered with, as long as their corporate interests, defense of the border, those sort of things, are respected, then it appears that they're going to go along with this. And that's, again, in Bolivian history, for the military to be anything but extremely right-wing is extraordinary. So that much is good. Now, with regards to bowing and scraping to the United States,
apologies for the crudeness there. You get the point.
No, Bolivians don't do bowing and scraping too well. But B, they're waiting on the U.S. election.
Yeah.
If Biden comes in, and if they don't act like, Maduro in Venezuela, then I'm sure the Democratic administration will have room to negotiate with them, find a modus vivendi, if you will. And even if Trump is reelected, Bolivia is a bit of an immovable object. I mean, what are you going to do? Invade them to get to the lithium? So I think he needs to, because the other thing too, talk about mandates, is Odyssey got a mandate. He won 57% of the vote. So he went over the 50% threshold as well. And so if you're going to mess with a democratically elected leader with that large a mandate, you're going to have a lot of people in arms up against you should you try to intervene with force. The fact that the Argentines, who have a border with Bolivia, are sympathetic to Odyssey, the fact that none of the neighbors really want to see Bolivia destabilized, indicates to me that the possibilities of Bolivia being able to pursue this second round of social democratic or democratic social experiment is, if not quite high, certainly has the potential to be both stable and secure until the next election.
Now, that's a nice point of hope, Paul. Appreciate that. And thank you again for your contribution this week in this episode of A View from Afar. And we thank you for our people that have joined us so far with this, and also for those that watch it on demand. Looking forward to bringing you another episode this time, same time, this time next week. Until then, thank you and take care.